We have an evening speaker tonight, and that is Colonel Gregory Marston. Those that attended the ceremony up at Mount Soledad will remember him. For those who were not up there, Colonel Marston graduated from the U.S. Air Force Academy and flew Air Force A-10A, the Warthog, and other attack aircraft during his 30-year military history. He was an A-10 wing commander and a squadron commander, and commanded the Afghans' largest base and Iraq's second largest Air Force base in the global war on terrorism. After 4 combat tours and 80 A-10 combat missions, he now is a military historian, author, and our distinguished speaker tonight.
Thank you, and I know everybody's eating, and I hope I'll help with your digestion with this presentation. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about, this is a really kind of extension of what so some of you have saw my speech on the 18th. This is really just expanding that out with pictures and with a little bit more information. But what we're going to talk about is China and SACO's contribution in World War II, kind of big picture. And at the very end, just for a few slides, I'm also going to compare what the SACO Tigers, what they did in World War II to kind of a modern war in Afghanistan, just so you can see kind of a comparison of how they lived and fought. Okay, so there's 3 parts. First, we're going to talk about what I call China alone. So China fought Japan in the second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 41. So I'm going to talk about that. And then in World War II, the United States joined China. They joined together to fight the Axis powers. And so SACO came into the picture in the CBI Theater. So that's the second part. And in the third part, we're going to have a little comparison kind of between World War II and the modern age in terms of what they did. This is non-political. Don't take sides, and any pictures from Afghanistan, either I took or my Air Force photography. Okay, I just put this picture up to show that I once was younger and thinner. Okay. Okay, I have a quick thank you. I want to thank Dan and Lynn. They actually looked at the things that I put up there because I didn't want to. I've only spent the last 2 months researching SACO, and want to make sure I was getting everything right, and they helped me with that. I also got help from Charles Miles, and he gave me some historical information. I do want to highlight one SACO veteran, Wade Brightbill. I met him a long time ago. I didn't know he was in SACO. I just knew he was a World War II veteran. He was a radio man first class. He was in Calcutta and for over a year. And then he also fought in Korea on the USS Tarawa, which is a carrier. And he was in communication. He then joined RCA, became a vice president there. But his family, his daughter and family, said he was proudest. He worked in Marin County, and he was a volunteer there, and he volunteered for like 30 years, and was in 2003 won Volunteer of the Year. So that's pretty impressive. And I met him about 45 years ago, and I also hung out with his daughter today and her husband Butch. They took care of me. So, thanks. Okay, so let's start with the presentation. China alone. So let's talk about Japan for just a second. After World War I, Japan was America's ally in World War I. But after World War I, Japan was caught up in kind of a crazed nationalism and kind of a militarism. They did not have many resources. And they started to think that we can just take resources from people by just conquering their country. It started in 1931, and I got a corner here. But this is Manchuria, which is up here in eastern China, and they took Manchuria. and took that over. They made it into a province called Manchukuo, and they also put a puppet government there. The threat to the rest of China was so great that in 1936, the civil war that was going on in China that was put on hold by both sides. But in 1937, the Japanese invaded China. And this picture right here, this is the only picture I could really get online, but all this pink area is from 1901. This is what Japan conquered in China. You can see the huge tracts of land that were conquered in China, and also, and I will talk about it, also all the ports. And this little green area right here, I'll explain that a little later. That's going to be the connection of the Burma Road. But basically, okay, so the Japanese invade China for real in 1937. Their objectives: natural resources for free, food for free, free workers. Okay? Their tactics were the 3 alls. So this was not just a military invasion, but also a genocidal conquest. Kill all, loot all, burn all. That's the way they operated. Okay. They attacked Beijing first. And this picture up here is a famous picture. All these pictures I got from American media newspapers and things. So all these things were being reported in the American newspapers. So this was a picture in Peking, which is Beijing now, of their initial invasion. They made a lot of advances. They really won a lot of victories in the first year. Late in 1937, they even attacked a Navy gunboat called the USS Panay, killed 4 sailors, wounded 40. Once again, made all the American newspapers. Unfortunately, for the Japanese, after the first year, they ran into a stalemate, and the Chinese military suffered a bunch of defeats. And what they did is they moved west into the mountainous regions of Western China and started launching a guerrilla campaign. So even though the Japanese were able to conquer large amounts of territory and conquer tens of millions of people, they couldn't get the whole thing. The big thing, as far as China was concerned, the big problem was that the Japanese conquered all the ports. Every single port from Shanghai down was conquered. And so there's no way to get supplies from the west to China. So what the Chinese did was they built the Burma Road. Okay. So this is Kunming here. And that's in Western China. That's where the Chinese nationalists centered. And they built a road that went from Kunming all the way down to Rangoon, which is in Burma. So it's 700 miles. They built it by hand with like 200,000 workers cutting through the jungle. It took about a year. That was the only way that they could get supplies. Now, just to give you a little history, in Desert Storm, so that was in 1990. So Desert Shield, Desert Storm, 90% of the supplies for Desert Storm came by ship. So ship, it's easy to move things. You move in huge quantities. Once you can't use ships, then it becomes much harder. So even though they built the Burma Road, it really put a constraint on the supply situation because they had to do it by truck. And so there's Rangoon in Burma, which is now called Myanmar. And you can see there's Kunming. That's where it was going. And this is kind of, those arrows just kind of show you, hey, this is how it got there. And just as this is a Happy Valley. I just want to show you where that was in later. Just give you a little perspective. Okay. We talked about it wasn't just a military invasion. There was also a huge amount of atrocities committed by the Japanese. One of these was in December 1937. It's called the Rape of Nanking. And that's the words that the American media used at that time. Okay. That was the term that they used. This picture right here, extremely famous. was on the front page of the New York Times. Okay. Within about 6-week period, the Japanese murdered, and so Nanking was the capital at that time when they conquered it. They murdered between 200,000 and 300,000 people. They raped over 200,000. They had this a picture here, once again, of officers just cutting people's heads off. They had beheading contests and things, crazy things like that, awful things. And it was just a military mayhem at just an unbelievable level for 6 weeks. Also, the Japanese had total control of the air. The Chinese Air Force was pretty much wiped out. And so they just used their bombers to attack Chinese cities and kill people. They would only attack, civilian targets, and it was just terror bombing of cities. So all these things were reported in the Western media, and there was a reaction. So even though the United States was isolationist at this period, there was a lot of reporting about China. This picture right here is Time magazine. So General Chiang Kai-shek and his wife were man and wife of the year in 1938. Okay. This right here I pulled up was from 1938. So the first thing that happened was church groups started to raise money for China. Okay. So there's 3 types of aids: civilian aid, military aid, and then also embargoes. So the first were church groups like this. So they're helping, to raise money for China, because a lot of the reporting came from missionaries and things from the interior. That's where they got a lot of the information. So there's huge amount of sympathy in the United States for China. Military aid took a little longer. So in 1939, President Roosevelt gave $25 million in military aid to China, which is about $530 million now. So it was significant. The Flying Tigers, which you probably may have heard about, came in 1940. So remember, the Chinese Air Force was almost wiped out. So President Roosevelt said, we'll send 100 fighter airplanes to China with American pilots, with maintenance people. This is the famous Flying Tigers, okay? And that helped protect the Burma Road and also stop the Japanese from attacking the Chinese cities with their terror bombs. The last thing the United States helped with Lend-Lease, as they did with other allies. The last thing that happened was America started, putting economic sanctions on Japan. The first one was 1938. It was called the moral embargo, which wouldn't mean much. In 1940, we stopped selling Japan scrap iron and iron. So that started to put a constriction. But the real thing that happened was in July 1941, we cut off oil. So 80 to 90% of the oil for Japan in that period was came from the United States. So we just cut the oil, with the hope that basically the Japanese would change and stop doing what they were doing, stop doing what they were doing in China. They were also attacking French Indochina, which is Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Now, that didn't work. The embargo convinced the Japanese that they needed to attack us. And so they attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Plan was to destroy the U.S. fleet, and they thought that the Americans would just kind of give up at that point. Probably one of the greatest, culture and military miscalculations of all time. They just did not understand that there was, in democracy, there's a differing opinion, and they just thought that we would kind of give up. So that didn't obviously work. A month before Pearl Harbor happened, they did a survey. Who wants to help out? Who wants to help China? Who wants to help Europe? 8%, only 8% of the Americans were in favor of helping either in Europe or China. Obviously, Pearl Harbor changed and united the country. Okay, for the first year, we and everybody else in the Pacific got our butts kicked. It was called the Japanese Blitzkrieg. The United States lost the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island. British lost Malaysia, Singapore. The Dutch East Indies, which is Indonesia and Borneo, was conquered. And eventually it even got to Burma was conquered in April of 1942. So if you look at this chart right here, all this red area was conquered by by Japan in less than 6 months. Huge, and really nothing to stop them. So now, see, all these port cities are cut off. The Burma roads cut. How are we going to get supplies to China? And it essentially was an air supply called Flying Hump. So we're in 1942. So the only way that we can get supplies to China in any form was via American military cargo airplanes. Okay, such as this one right here. Okay, so it involved flying out of India, so bringing supplies into India by ship, bringing them by train up to here, and then flying them over to Kunming, over the Himalaya Mountains, which are the highest mountain range in the world. Okay. And that's a big deal when you're talking about, you know, the technology of that time. These planes could only get to 19,000. The mountains are at 17,000. So they're flying in valleys and doing things like that. And it was extremely dangerous. Okay. The other thing that happened was that the major Allied, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt decided that Europe had to be the biggest theater because they considered Nazism and the German military and the research and development things be so far ahead of us that they had to be the main target. So basically 90% of supplies went to the European theater. The Pacific theater was next. So the Pacific that the Marines and the Army would fight and the Navy would fight became second. And the third and last theater was the CBI theater. So CBI stands for China-Burma-India. So they were last to get supplies. And they got the least amount of supply. And the only way to get supplies is by air. So there's a huge amount of effort to get just a teeny amount of supplies to China. It was a huge constraint, and it lasted for 3 years. In 1942, America started to turn around the Battle of Midway. We just saw the Midway ship. So in April, we launched the Doolittle raid, which was American bombers took off on the Hornet, bombed a few cities in Japan, landed in China. We'll talk about that later. Really quite minor, but kind of shocked the Japanese. That led to the Battle of Midway, where they lost a good portion of their carrier fleet. And then it went on with the Guadalcanal. So 1942 was a turnaround year in the Pacific. Okay, so there's that little X is Rangoon. Rangoon's been captured. That's been captured. So there we got to fly from India, basically, to Kunming by air. That's the only way to get supplies. Just to give you a little perspective, these planes could carry 3 tons. Let's just keep it simple. 3 tons. A modern C-17 can carry 81 tons. A Liberty ship, which was they're kind of small considered now, could carry 1,400 tons. So just think about that. It would take like 400 of these to equal 1 Liberty ship. You know, we built 2,500 Liberty ships. So, you know, that's the amount, the small amount of supplies that China was able to get. Okay, and there's there's Happy Valley, just to give you a perspective. Okay, so SACO comes in, as I said, with an agreement between Chiang Kai-shek. So here's Chiang Kai-shek, Roosevelt, Churchill, and his wife in April 1943. Okay, what was SACO's mission? Keep, help China win the war with Japan. Unfortunately, 70% of all the Japanese forces were in China. 70%, 38 out of 51 divisions were in China. The vast majority of their army was in China. And we couldn't get, no matter what we wanted to do, we could not get them supplies because of the restrictions that I talked about. So that was, SACO was basically, as I said here, impossible mission on a shoestring. There's this huge army, we can get you very little supplies, do the best you can. That's kind of what they did. Okay, so what are the 4 things? what were their four main missions? What was SACO's four main missions? The first one is weather. So today we have weather satellites, you get weather pictures and stuff. They didn't have that then. So the first thing is they needed weather reports from all over China, including the occupied areas, because they needed to, take all those weather reports, send it to the Pacific, have the weather people look at it, and then try and predict what the weather was going to be in the Pacific, because it happened in China first. If that makes sense. So that was huge then. Otherwise things would happen in the Pacific. Oh, here comes a hurricane, or typhoon. Sorry, here comes a typhoon. Oh yeah, things like that. So they needed the weather reports, and they needed to coalesce all these weather reports from all over China. So that was a big effort. The second thing was intelligence on the Japanese. Same thing. We have to get intelligence report on those 70% of the Japanese that are in China. What are they doing? What are they sending to the Pacific? Same thing. And, what are they putting on the ships? When are the ships leaving? So that was like hugely important to the U.S. submarines and stuff. So once again, we know what the Japanese are doing. And the same thing, they were kind of similar in that you're getting all these weather reports from all over China, but you also get all these intelligence reports. And there's no SATCOM, there's no computer, there's no internet. It was all by radio. The third thing was to train the Chinese forces. So the Chinese army had been running a guerrilla war for several years against the Japanese, but SACO, essentially made them better and helped them, gave them weapons, got them organized, and blending in with the population to fight the Japanese army with limited resources. The last mission was to scout invasion sites in China, in case the Navy decide to invade China. So two of these pictures came right off the web. Okay, so this SACO Tigers and the rice paddy Navy, how did they do it? They live, many of you know, kind of preaching to the choir here, but this is new for me when I researched it. They lived and worked with the Chinese, the national Chinese. They lived and worked with them. Right near the capital. It's a secret organization. Nobody else knew about. The command structure, as many of you know, was fine. They did a strict meritocracy, so whoever was the best leader was going to be in charge of a certain unit, whether they were Chinese or American. Okay, and you had Guy Lee and Captain, who was then Miles, working together. Okay, 2,500 personnel. The vast, 95% were Navy, 3% Marines, and 2% Coast Guard. And some of those were in India. Amazingly, only 5 were killed, but none of them were in China. And this is a picture right here of some of that training. Okay, so now we're up to 1944. The stalemate has continued. We still can't get very many supplies. America gave 3% of our lend-lease. So lend-lease was about 17% of the total American war production went to lend-lease. So we were giving away 17% of what we made in America over the war years. Unfortunately, only 3% went to China, and a lot of it was simply we just couldn't get it to them. There was no way to do it. It was the lowest priority theater. You had a super restricted supply line. There was also huge command problems in CBI theater, which many books have been written about it. Okay, the CBI theater itself was a tough theater because you're fighting in Burma, which is all jungle. It has 4 or 5 months of monsoon, which is just pretty much continuous rain, malaria problems, and the fact that there were so many Japanese in China and fighting in the CBI theater. In fact, the Japanese were losing the war, the Nazis were losing the war, but in 1944, the Japanese invaded India. That's how good they thought they were doing the CBI theater. And the Chinese nationalists contributed 2 armies, basically, to help in the CBI theater in Burma. This last picture, so there's the Chinese nationalists fighting here. with the American helping them. The Americans also had an effort in China where they had this new plane called the B-29. It was the most expensive weapons program in World War II. It was more expensive than the atomic bomb. Okay, so the B-29 was this big bomber, and they wanted to use it, so they said, let's build some airfields in China, and then we'll bomb Japan. Well, there are no airfields in China at the time, so they used hundreds of thousands of people taking river rocks, breaking them by hand, and you can see this picture here of them, like making runways out of rock. But it was extremely inefficient because once again, you had to fly the weapons and fuel over the hump, over the Himalayas to get to China. Okay, so now we're at the last year of the war, 1945. It's all been a stalemate. Finally, some things start to happen. The Chinese armies in Burma and the British and Americans pushed the Japanese out of India and out of northern Burma, and that allowed the Americans to reconnect the Burma Road from India. That was called the Lido Extension. And this is a picture of what it looks like today. Look at that. Okay, that's the cut right through the mountains and jungle. Okay, but that finally, in the beginning of 1945, they're able to at least get trucks, through India. And the first supplies came by in January 45, and that sort of opened things up for the Chinese and for the SACO people. So now we finally have some supplies. The other thing, saying this airports, they finally canceled the STUM program, to build these airfields in China. And here's another. This is how you make a runway out of rocks. Feel my hand. So they moved the B-29s to the Marianas Islands, and finally, they're able to make some headway in China. Okay, so what did Chinese nationalists and SACO tires, what did they really contribute to? The biggest thing was they sapped the Japanese army. 70% of the Japanese army was stuck the whole war fighting in China. That's huge. Okay? The way I said it is they couldn't win and they couldn't leave. And they wouldn't. Okay? This saved tens of thousands of American lives. Marine battles were fought, they just barely won. If the Japanese had been able to take the forces in China and move them to the Pacific Theater with double, triple, quadruple the people they had, we might not have won some of those battles. Or we would have lost a lot more Americans. Okay? So that was the big thing. They kept the Chinese, pinned down. The second thing, they supplied the weather intelligence. It doesn't sound like a lot, but if you don't have weather and you don't know what's coming, you can't be nearly as effective, especially in the modern world. So in modern terms, what we call is you're a force multiplier. You're got a little force, but you're pulling 5 times your weight in terms of what you did. So they helped make the Chinese army better. They made them better guerrillas, saboteurs, as we talked about. They killed, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers. They blew up bridges, locomotives, boats, all that stuff, tying the Japanese down. Increased supplies to China and help with things with medical care. This is these are Chinese fighters here with American equipment. There's one of the bombers, with the kids load the broken rocks, and this was a poster from World War II. Our help for the Chinese. Okay, as I said, by the last year of the war, they had doubled the amount of Chinese that they were killing, the guerrillas were killing, and that was huge. In terms of helping the Air Force, besides just building airfields, they rescued a bunch of people that were shot down. And we talked about the Dula Raiders. Here's a picture of the Dula Raiders. This is where they were on the carrier in 1942. Almost every single one of them landed in China, and all of them were rescued. Okay? Out of the ones that were caught in Japan, several were beheaded. So if these guys hadn't been rescued by the Chinese, they would have been killed, just like the ones that were caught in Japan by the Japanese. So they helped 80 Dula Raiders, and there's a price for that, which I will talk about later. They built airfields from scratch, and they gave critical intel to the Air Force pilots that were working their Army Air Corps. So now we're going to go to part two. So we talked about SACO, what the military did, and we talked about what SACO did. But let's talk about what the Chinese people did. Okay? And the truth is they suffered horribly under the Japanese yoke. Okay? 14 million Chinese were killed. Starvation, military action, terror bombings, and as I'm going to talk about, biological warfare. It was horrible. Okay, over 11 million Chinese were internal refugees, villages destroyed, pushed out from wherever they lived, and of course, the huge atrocities. Something that the Japanese tried to hide after the war, but things were they were finding information. They had a unit that was called Unit 731. They did biological warfare, so they were basically using Chinese citizens. For cute, horrible biological experiments. And they were doing things like, let's build a bomb that's made out of clay and we'll fill it with 30,000 bubonic plague fleas and drop it in a village and see what happens. Okay? And you can figure out what happens. And then at the end of the war, let's destroy this horrible place, this horrible hospital that we built of death. And then they let out all these rats that were infected with bubonic plague, and then that killed 20,000 people who lived nearby. So that's this picture right up here. I couldn't show you the other one. Here's the Dula Raiders, and this is the rape in Nanking where let's just shoot people. The Dula Raiders, they helped 80 Dula Raiders get back to the United States. 250,000 Chinese were killed because of that. Either because they directly helped, and what happened was these flyers were giving them little tokens like a flashlight or a little, lighter or a patch or something. They would find that article, and then they would kill everybody in the village. So that's how they killed 250,000 people, just because they helped that this unit. Okay, so what was the overall contribution? The Chinese forces and SACO, kept Japan engaged and mobilized. China itself suffered horribly through the war, but it sped the U.S. victory. That's all you can say. My estimate, if nothing backed it up, was at least 50,000 Americans, Marines, and soldiers were saved because they were occupied. They couldn't move them into the Pacific. So SACO was a force multiplier for all the things we talk about, weather, intelligence, and training up the Chinese. Okay, so now we're at part three. I'm almost done. Get back to your dessert. Quick, we're going to just talk real about how SACO lived, how they lived, fought, and just things about their personnel versus what's happened in the Afghanistan war. Okay, which is just ended. Okay, similarities and differences. It's going to be real fast. Just going to talk about some of the differences. So this is a little village I went by. This house was on fire, and these kids came out. Okay. Let's talk about the similarities. World War II, the SACO Tigers. You people know this because they were your fathers and grandfathers. But what I can say is, especially the people that I was with, there was high morale and high discipline. Your guys weren't, you had kind of a different leadership, but they still kept it together and did a lot of things. And the same thing happened in Afghanistan. There was very few discipline problems. And I was there right after 9/11. Okay, so that's the first thing. People were really motivated with what they were doing. The second thing, air power is a key. These are the pictures of flying tigers. So, for China to stay in the war, we had to have airplanes to keep them in the war. We had to have planes keeping, protecting the Burma Road. We had to have planes protecting the cargo planes coming in. Air power is key in Afghanistan. We were supplied by air. People came in by air, they left by air. 90 5% of our supplies came by air. The only thing that we got by land was fuel. Just like Afghanistan, the SACO Tigers were a low priority theater. The CBI theater was the bottom theater. I was in Afghanistan right in the middle of it. It invaded Iraq, and we became number 3. So it was Iraq, invasion, 150,000, 30,000 people are in South Korea. We have 15,000 in Afghanistan. We became a low priority, and that was the same with the SACO Tigers. Primitive living conditions. I took this picture like the second day. This is what an MVG looks at. Night vision goggle looks like. It's completely dark and blacked out, but through that lens, you could see that. So everybody lived in tents, and just conditions, they weren't intense, but it was very, very primitive for the SACO Tigers. America's entry in the war for World War II was the same. Attack Pearl Harbor, 9/11. So it started with an attack. Very low casualties, we just talked about. Even the CBI theater did not have high casualties, and neither in Afghanistan. The last 18 months in Afghanistan, they did not lose one man. It was only about 20 people in Afghanistan over 20 years. Great support for the troops. You've heard all the stories of the Victory Gardens and how much the American public did in World War II, and Afghanistan was the same. We got thousands of packages from random people, all the United States, sending us food, just all kinds of things, to any serviceman in Afghanistan. And what I did as a commander, we'd give it to the lowest ranking person, and then they would share. That's how it worked. They would get a box, open it up, take out what they wanted, pass it around. By the end, there wouldn't be anything left. But you can't imagine how important that is for morale to know that when you're 8,000 miles away, that the people in the United States care about what you're doing. Right? Okay, so let's talk about some differences. In World War II, there were draftees and volunteers. I would say probably, I don't have anything backed it up, there are probably a lot more volunteers for the SACO Tigers than for the normal World War II service person. About 70% of the people in World War II were draftees. Okay, but there were volunteers. Okay, in Afghanistan, everybody was a volunteer. And in fact, to get to Afghanistan, you had to volunteer twice. You had to volunteer to go. So you were like a double volunteer. So that was a little bit of a difference. And also the levels of training. People in World War II were going into war with the amount of training that we would almost consider criminal now, but that's just the nature of the things. They had to get into the war fast, and hey, you did it with what you had, with the training you had. Obviously, we had things, amazing technologies over the last 80 years. Night vision goggles, I show you that picture, allows us to work at night. GPS, everybody uses that now. Body armor. This woman right here is wearing body armor, so it's bulletproof. Unfortunately, it weighs about 40 pounds, so it doesn't matter whether you're a man or woman, you gotta be able to carry it. Okay, so body armor works. First aid got, 5 times better, and everybody knows how to do it. This isn't just for the, I made all my airmen know emergency first aid, and it saved their lives. And then they used it. I've had people come up to me and said, "Thank you, I saved, my uncle," or something like that. Okay, I think now services work together. This was the outcome after Vietnam. They really hadn't, the services still weren't working together, and I think they do better now. Our base was multi-service, and we helped each other. Our base at Bagram was attacked, and I don't think the SACO Tigers ever were. Obviously, World War II was 2.5 years, and Afghanistan went for 20 years. Women in combat. So I had actually the first women that really had, no kidding, combat jobs. They worked in my security police. Was one of them. And this is before Congress said it was okay. This was like 5 years before they said it was okay. So we just did it anyway. Okay, and they did great. I could not find out this, and maybe somebody can tell me later. I do not know whether the SACO Tigers had alcohol, but we had no alcohol and no drugs. and there were drug tests. So it was super, there was no messing around with that. All the things that happened in Vietnam basically, caused us to really crack down on this, and it made this one much better, even though it was tougher. But I just said to the guys, look, think of this like a health vacation, you don't eat that beer for, time, and you'll be eating dinner, and the girls will love you when you get that. They didn't believe me, but anyway, there was no alcohol, and we had a lot fewer problems than some of the other bases on Bagram that did have alcohol. Okay, we were restricted at the base. This was the Vietnam thing. People did not go off the base. We did not do anything with the Afghans. I did some things, humanitarian things, super controlled. This was because of Vietnam, and also because of what the Russians did. Because the Russians, when they conquered Afghanistan, did the same thing the Japanese did. Won't go into that, but it was bad. And that's why the Afghans rose against them. They loved us. All right. So I'm near the end here. And I'm just, Americans haven't changed that much. Okay. I had Gen X's and millennials working. I did not have Gen Z. But the young, 50% of my people were from 18 to 21. Okay. And they're still the same as they were back. Okay. You give them a reason why they're there, and they work hard, and they would do things. Tough conditions, they worked in. Really impressed. They fought hard. They had high motivation. The same way their grandfathers. Whether it was 2.5 years or 20 years. Yes, there were a few problems in Afghanistan as time went on. The war went for 20 years. It's still epic. I think leadership was the key. As you saw, as you heard many stories between Dai Li and Captain Miles, they had a unique leadership style, but they were willing to take chances and do things that were a little bit different to make it work. And I'm a firm believer in that. You're there to win the war, not to get a medal or anything else. Okay. And in the end, the civilian leaders make the decision about when the military goes to war and how it ends. So that's what happened. And that's what happened in Afghanistan. Afghanistan, U.S. military did not lose an engagement. They didn't lose a battle. They didn't lose, 10 guys fighting against 20 guys. We never lost anything. But the war ended the way it did. So, should have written some articles of this. Not blame the Afghanistan veterans for the way the war ended, because they won. Thank you for your time. And I got one little thing here. I'm just a poor. I have a book, and if you feel the need, I just finished this book, and I'm on Amazon. So I'm making a shameless plug. It's on Amazon.